all of your accomplishments and your life now. And I know many do. Chuck Ozog writes poetry about this, and Tracy Tarver's just finished her book about brain injury. I think Tracy's here in the crowd. Is Tracy here? She's coming up from the Cape. But Tracy and I met several years ago in a writer's workshop down in Provincetown, each with the intention of writing a memoir. And it took us more years than we thought to get around to doing it, but now we both have books. So it's so important. We learn from each other, we learn about each other, and we learn from each other. Every family caregiver standing here today is the lead character in your loved one's survival story. And you have a book that you could also write about how the challenges that you've met and the ways you've grown and changed as a person and become an advocate. So every family member and family caregiver has a story to tell also. In Massachusetts, we have a very distinguished legacy of a personal story causing a profound and necessary change. It was 30 years ago this month that Marilyn Spivak and Dr. Martin Spivak founded the National Head Injury Foundation at their kitchen table. And that was because their daughter Debbie, where's Debbie? Is she here? She's here. Oh, she's late. All right, she'll be here. You'll know when Debbie arrives. You'll meet her. There were no specialized brain injury rehabilitation services 30 years ago. There were no state organizations to give people resources. So the Spivaks joined with Arlene Korab and Inter Hall and other outstanding families to form this grassroots organization that's now become the Brain Injury Association of America with chapters in 40 states. That all came about because of Debbie's story that spurred people to action. Every great political and social action movement starts with a powerful story that stirs a lot of people to action, but it all starts with just a few who know exactly what it's about. There have been tremendous advances in brain injury prevention and treatment and rehabilitation over the last 30 years. We all know that. However, our work is far from done. Have you heard? You just heard from John Auerbach that brain injury is on the rise in Massachusetts and across the country, from sports concussions, from falls, accidents, and now, unfortunately, from war-related injuries. Let me just go over a couple of the numbers, because they're so high, I often stop and think, can that be true? Can those numbers be true? Why don't we hear more about this? You'll see these posters as you're walking around the pond. Every year in the United States, 1.7 million people suffer some form of brain injury. 1.7. And that's mostly the traumatic brain injuries that they keep track of. There's many other kinds that aren't even tracked. Now that 1.7 million people is greater than the number of people who develop breast cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, and spinal cord injury, all combined every year. More people have brain injuries, and yet federal funding for brain injury prevention and treatment is a teensy fraction of what it is for those other terrible diseases. So one of the battles we have to keep fighting is for equity in research monies and treatment. Over 3 million people live with the consequences of a traumatic brain injury across the country. And now an estimated 300,000 wounded servicemen and women from the Iraq and Afghani wars have some degree of brain injury. 300,000. This is going to change healthcare, lots of policies, education, life in our communities.
Wow, that a lot. I didn't believe
for many, many years
that much.
Right here in Massachusetts, 44,000 people in Massachusetts sustain a traumatic brain injury every year. Isn't that a high number? So our work to prevent and treat brain injury and guarantee a life of quality, productivity, and inclusion for survivors and family members must remain an urgent battle. Our individual and collective presence here today gives fervent testimony to how far we've all come, but how far we still have left to go. Today, for the 8th year, we come to Heads Held High as a celebration, a reunion, and a public demonstration of our individual and collective strength and power. I'd like to
Wow,
invoke the legacy
thank you. That was
and
a lady named Janet who used to work at Boston. I went to Jamaica Pond to hear her talk back, and back in October 2nd. That was in
wow, look how much further you went since I did
2010.
So
Well, this is George Wood's talk.
And energized by
And
meeting so many
bye.
other families whose life had been shattered and rebuilt after brain injury. Alan shared his story of life after brain injury with survivors who were just starting rehabilitation to give them hope and motivation. And you do that too. Every time you share your story with someone who's a step behind you on this journey, you're giving them hope and inspiration and some practical tips. Alan spoke forcefully to community groups, schools, medical professionals, and our local politicians. That's the important part today. Together we wrote letters advocating changes for people with disabilities and public policy.
Yeah, that is very, very important. That picture, you might be disabled in a wheelchair too.
Every one of us has a powerful story to
Yeah,
share,
we
as Alan
do.
did, to raise awareness about brain injury.
My
Your
house
story
is
can be a
George
tool for
Wood.
change.